fairy tale of Rip Van Winkle, a villager living in New York State in the 1700s, wanders into the wilderness, falls asleep, and wakes up to discover a totally different world. His beard is a foot long, no one in town recognizes him, and something called the American Revolution has happened. Let's imagine a modern version of Rip Van Winkle, a man who dozed off in the year 1917, slept for a century, and woke up to a drastically different world. One of transcontinental flights, pocket-sized supercomputers, political representation of women and minorities, and millions rising out of poverty worldwide. Our Rip Van Winkle would be shocked, fascinated, and overwhelmed. Luckily, if he needed to relax, there's one place he could go to immediately feel at home. School. The average schoolroom of 2017 would feel shockingly similar to the schoolroom of 1917, a welcome relief for any confused time traveler. But as Rip started learning more about the modern world, the schoolroom would not relax him for very long. Why, he might ask, hadn't a century of progress changed how children are educated? In a world where agricultural and factory labor were being replaced by creative and non-routine jobs, why do students still sit in rows and do repetitive exercises, even if those exercises are on iPads instead of pen and paper? In a world where the most successful people seem to create their own paths, why did schools seem to teach people mostly how to follow orders? Seeing all this, would a modern Rip Van Winkle even send his kids to school? Or would he see school as helplessly behind the times and opt for a radically different path to give his children the education they actually needed to thrive in the modern world? One reality that liberals and conservatives consistently agree upon today is that our schools are failing. And in an era of unprecedented political division, that should tell us something. Everyone agrees that schools need to change, they need to get better, they need to stop failing their students. Yet at the same time as we criticize schools, we continue participating in them, and funding them, and accepting their demands. We send our kids to school for a majority of their waking hours, often against their wills. We revere test scores and grade point averages. Why do we demonstrate so much faith in something that we also claim to disapprove of? Our hypocrisy, I think, stems from confusing the ideal of school and the reality of school. As an ideal, school is beautiful. A group of bright-eyed students sits in a well-ordered classroom, enthralled by a passionate and well-trained teacher. Young people of all races and social classes work together harmoniously, opening their minds and discarding their bigotries. A common core of knowledge is instilled in a new generation of youngsters, preparing them for rigorous college studies, globally competitive careers, and lives as engaged citizens. Here's the problem with that. How soon did your bullshit detector start to go off? Was it the first sentence? Maybe the second sentence? We have a beautiful vision of what school can be, but an unending parade of news reports, anecdotes, and personal experiences tell us differently. Choose your poison. Bullying, boredom, over-medication, teenage suicide, cheating, lack of preparation for college, lack of transferable career skills. These are the actual realities of modern school. Not every school has these problems, of course, but too many schools have too many of these problems. I went to well-funded public schools in Southern California in the 1980s and 90s, and I remember the bullying and the harassments and the fights and the racial conflicts, which were virtually unmoderated by school staff. I remember the feelings of irrelevance and disconnection and the soul-sucking boredom. And I remember this unquestionable student culture of copying and cheating and gaming the system, doing as little as possible to get the most results. I also remember some of the friends that I made, and a few great moments in the classroom, and a handful of teachers who really inspired me. There are good memories alongside the mediocre ones. And because time heals many wounds, I think it's easy to look back on our own time in school and remember the highlights. The adventures, the magic moments of youth, most of which probably happened outside the classroom anyways. And forget the inane homework, the bathroom passes, the window gazing, the tedium of waiting for teachers to spend a half an hour addressing discipline issues so that they can do 15 minutes of actual teaching. Why on earth would we remember these parts of school? We leave school and almost none of us go back into school. We forget the bad experiences and we glorify the good ones. We make movies and television shows that show how incredible the high school experience is. And then after 10 or 20 years of adult life, of forgetting what school is often actually like, we decide it's time to send our own kids to school. But if we were to clearly assess the reality of school, we must see clearly first. And to do this, I think it helps to listen to some of those who have worked on the inside. Here are some of their voices. John Taylor Gatto spent 26 years as a public school teacher in New York City, helping kids get out of his English school classroom and do things in their communities like service projects, apprenticeships, start businesses, organize political campaigns. By doing this, he won the New York City Teacher of the Year Award 3 times in a row. And then he won the New York State Teacher of the Year Award. And then immediately after that, he quit his job because he said he no longer wanted to make a living hurting kids. He started writing and speaking about the system which he believed wasn't really teaching things to kids in the way that we believe it is, but instead teaching hidden lessons. In one of his all-time famous articles called The 7-Lesson School Teacher, he said that what he really teaches to his middle school English class is confusion, class position, indifference, emotional and intellectual dependency, provisional self-esteem, and a lack of privacy. It was Gatto who inspired me at age 21 to leave my own path. I was studying sciences in college, and I instead decided to become a full-time student of alternative education, because I read one of his books. Another voice, Will Richardson. He spent 22 years as a public school educator before he left to begin speaking about what he considers the obvious realities of school that few educators want to talk about. He calls these the elephants in the classroom. Here are some of them. The first is that most students forget most of the content that we claim to teach in the classroom. There are studies to back this up. The fact that most students are typically bored and engaged in their classes. The fact that what we assess in school typically does not matter that much for future success. The fact that what we call curriculum is mostly just a guess at what's important. And finally, that informal learning, self-directed learning, is typically what leads us to lifelong success, and that formal learning plays a very minor role when it comes down to it. These are the things that Will Richardson believes everyone knows, but doesn't want to talk about because the results of that conversation would be too difficult to handle. So now he goes around speaking to parents, teachers, and administrators about what 21st century learning should actually look like. One of my favorites of him is that he says that not only should every test be an open book test, it should be an open phone test, meaning you can Google stuff, and he thinks it should be an open network test, which means you can talk to your friends. Because that is the reality in which we are going into. We don't take tests in real life in the way that we do in school. We use every resource at our disposal. That's what we need to be doing. Grace Llewellyn began her teaching career at an idyllic, small, private, independent school in Colorado. Her class only had 19 students. But as she would soon write in her underground classic book, The Teenage Liberation Handbook, How to Quit School and Get a Real Life in Education, she realized that this small, caring, creative school was fundamentally the same as any ordinary public school because it controlled students' lives. She began advocating for young people to drop out of school, or she actually used the term rise out of school, and start regaining true control over their lives. Llewellyn's book was another major influence in my choice to work with teenagers outside of school. I'm pretty sure here's the line that hooked me. How strange and self-defeating that a supposedly free country should train its young for life in totalitarianism. That doesn't polarize you, then there's something wrong. Yet another voice, the novelist Nicholson Baker, summarized my own high school experience better than I ever could in my own words. He substituted in his hometown for a month, and then he wrote this fantastic piece in the New York Times Magazine, emphasizing how much of students' time is simply wasted in school. Here's what he wrote. Teachers spend half their time shouting themselves hoarse as young adults are infantilized. Their lives are absurdly regimented. Every minute is accounted for. They sit in one hot room after another and wait for each class to end. Time thickens. It becomes like saltwater taffy. It becomes viscous and sticky. It stretches out and folds back on itself through endless repetition. God, that's great. That's what high school felt like for me. That's what middle school felt like for me. Primary school, I was probably a little bit more engaged than I think most young people are. There are just fewer issues with grades 1 through 5 than there are going past that. But high school, hit the nail on the head. The ideas I'm arguing here are simple and I believe non-controversial. Having more control over your life is better than having less control. Maximizing the time you spend doing things for their own sake is superior to time spent doing things out of obligation, shame, or fear. An educated person knows what she wants to do and then she does those things. She has a vision and then she executes on it. But could education really be this simple? Could it really just be about doing your own thing? I think the answer is yes, but in this simplicity there's also depth. Self-determination theory, which is a widely regarded theory of human motivation, proposes that all people have 3 innate needs. Autonomy, which means having control over your actions. Competence, which means the chance to build mastery, to go deep into something, get really good. And relatedness, which is about positive connection with other human beings and a sense of purpose. When these needs are fulfilled, humans can act with intrinsic motivation. That means they can do things, even very challenging things, for their own sake. But when these needs are not fulfilled, intrinsic motivation falters. We no longer want to do things for their own sake. That's when we need extrinsic motivation. In other words, threats and bribes, carrots and sticks, in order to motivate people to take action. I think intrinsic motivation is what we need more of in this world, and extrinsic motivation is what we need less of. History is one long, bloody record of wars, slavery, servitude, religious persecution, and other forms of gross extrinsic motivation. Depending on who we're talking to, it's only been in the last 200 or 100 or 50 years where common people have actually had the chance to do their own thing, to choose their own paths, to live lives of intrinsic motivation. Yet, extrinsic motivation is so clearly the lifeblood of school. That is what it is built upon. All the grades, the gold stars, the class rankings, the detentions, the low-level threats of if you don't do this, then you will ruin your life down the line, that's extrinsic motivation pure and simple. And so it makes sense that kids in school are not motivated. And when you start thinking about all these radical alternatives of like, what if they didn't go to school? Well, people are lazy, so they won't do anything. Consider that what we're really evaluating is people's reaction to their basic needs not being fulfilled in this system we call school that uses massive amounts of extrinsic motivation. So let's go deeper into this. How exactly does school fail to fulfill the 3 needs here? We're going to give school a self-determination report card. Okay. Autonomy. So sorry. There is almost no autonomy in school. You have to ask to go to the bathroom. Okay? If you think that choosing an elective class or an essay topic is real choice, then you are poorly misinformed of your possibilities in life. Competence. No, I'm so sorry. This cannot develop in school because in school we are forced to learn a little about everything and deeply about nothing. And if your interests lie outside of the traditional academic subjects, let's say you want to design video games or study horses, you stand almost 0 chance of developing mastery in school. And if you say, well, you can learn that stuff at home, no, because school has invaded our homes with the thing they call homework. Finally, relatedness, which I think is perhaps the young person's most pressing need. as they move from a stage of adult-oriented development to peer-oriented development is very low quality in school. Yes, there are other kids in school because schools have monopolized kids. They essentially said, you are legally obligated to be here. So yes, you find other people in schools, therefore you have a chance to connect with them, granted. But most of your time in school is in the classroom or some other tightly regulated sphere, or these fleeting moments between classes and at lunch, maybe right after school. That's all of the connection, all of the relatedness time that you get. It's meager. If we are preparing young people to act with intrinsic motivation in this world, then we are indeed failing. I'm so sorry, school. You failed the test. In most schools, there are no real choices to be made, no real skills to be developed, and no change, excuse me, no change. You right, like, nothing to genuinely connect you with other people in the school. It's no wonder that if you had to choose a societal institution that most closely resembles school, it would be jail. It seems clear to me that whatever an education is, it must empower you to lead your own life. It must minimize your chances of being manipulated, of being made a pawn, of being an actor in somebody else's play. Any place that claims to educate must give young people actual autonomy, encourage them to develop actual competencies and facilitate actual social connections. It should produce self-aware and self-motivated humans, not anxiety-riddled worker bees awaiting their next order. Places of education must lift people up and bring them together as we envision the ideal of school, not crush their spirits and isolate them, as too often is the reality of school. But do these places exist? Can they exist? I'm disappointed not more of you laughed at my meme. I just got to process that for a second.
I laughed.
Thank you. Yes, these kinds of places that are actually educational exist. And for the past 2 decades, there's been this quiet revolution happening in the United States that has been growing the next generation of educational alternatives. The earlier revolution, of course, was the 1960s. And the countercultural revolution brought us the first generation of school critics and inspired a tidal wave of new alternative schools and colleges. But the empire struck back. Most of the radical schools closed, and the educational establishment returned in full force in the 70s and 80s with a renewed focus on standardized testing. You like that?
I did.
It wasn't until the final decade of the 20th century that new life was breathed into the alternative education movement. We can chalk it up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the advent of the internet and the personal computer, prosperity of the Clinton era, or, this is my personal explanation, the fact that the hippie generation finally had children, and they were sending them to school. All of this, perhaps, conspired to make the 90s when really cool educational alternatives started happening again. Let's look at some of these. In Massachusetts, a middle school teacher named Ken Danford and his friend Josh Hornick quit their jobs to create a learning center that offered all the benefits of a really great progressive school. So caring staff, interesting classes, lots of time for deep discussions, but with none of the coercive or the arbitrary restrictions of regular school. They called it North Star, and they say that it's not a school. Don't call us a school. We're more like a club, a community center. You can come here 1 day a week, 2, 3, or 4. You can't come 5, though, because 5 feels too much like school. You're free to attend any of our fabulous classes that you want, go to any of our activities, a huge drama program, sports, but the only requirement is that you meet with the staff advisor periodically. There's no requirement that you go to any of these classes. If you want to sit on the couch and play Pokemon Go, I guess you wouldn't be sitting on the couch and playing Pokemon Go. If you want to sit on the couch and play some other idle video game, you can do that. Couch. If you want to build a moving couch, you can build a moving couch and play Pokemon Go on it. That's me, thank you. Because you don't have to go to this place full time, many of the students at North Star hold part-time jobs, so they take college classes at the same time. North Star only charges between $3,000 and $7,500 per year, and they've never turned a family away due to lack of financial ability. And inspired by this North Star model, more than a dozen other groups have opened similar learning centers across the eastern United States just in the past decade. Okay, remember Grace Llewellyn, the one who wrote the Teenage Liberation Handbook, Totalitarianism, that one? Yeah. So, she observed in the 90s that homeschooling had recently become legal in all 50 of the United States. This was a product of a rare alliance between conservative Christians who wanted to homeschool their kids because they didn't like the culture of their kids were finding out about in school, dinosaurs and condoms, essentially. And crunchy liberals who were part of the whole grown hippie, back to the land movement, and also didn't want to send their kids to school. And so these two groups came together and made homeschooling legal in all 50 states. Some states are easier than others to start homeschooling, none are terribly difficult. And so Grace observed that, well, if you don't have a cool place like North Star in your community, then what are you going to do? Homeschooling is actually the easiest way to get educational freedom as quickly as possible. And in some cases, like in California, you just need to sign a single piece of paper. In October, you file something called the private school affidavit. And you say, yes, my home is a private school, so I'm fulfilling the compulsory education law. And then you can do whatever you want. That's it. There's no requirements. You don't have to take any tests. You don't have to do anything. So there's a lot of freedom to homeschool right now in the United States, and it has been that way for about 20 years. Llewellyn was less interested in homeschooling per se as she was in something called unschooling. Unschooling is, so when most people think about homeschooling, you think about school at home, right? It's like you're still doing the regular curriculum, but mom's teaching you algebra instead of the crazy algebra teachers. Unschooling is much more like you do whatever you want. It's about self-directed learning. It's about following the child and their interests. And along the way, if you pick up some math, great. If you don't, they'll probably figure it out later if it's important to them. That's the unschooling approach. My company is called Unschool Adventures. I have some unschoolers with me here. You can see how terribly deficient they are after the talk. Grace Llewellyn started a summer camp for unschoolers. That's what's pictured here. And it's called Not Back to School Camp. It's where teenagers who are not going back to school in the fall go instead to hang out with each other. That's where I got to know a lot of real-life, flesh and blood teenage unschoolers because I had just started studying this stuff academically in college. I'd read about unschooling. I'd read Grace's book. When I finally got to meet them, I was a little afraid. It's like, when I finally got to meet them, they blew away all my expectations. I was like, I got to continue working with this group. And so that's when I started Unschool Adventures, which is the travel company for teenage unschoolers. That's why we're here. Let's see, a little bit more about homeschooling and unschooling. You can leave school legally in the United States right now and start doing homeschooling or unschooling, whatever flavor you want. And there are going to be a lot of local groups to support you. There are going to be communities of other people doing it. There are conferences. Homeschool graduates, whatever that means, experience very few barriers in the United States to entering college and the workplace. And there's all these new forms of so-called homeschooling coming up. Micro-schooling is a new thing where parents get together and they find the absolute best teacher they can find on a certain subject. They're like, we're going to get the best biology teacher we can. They hire some hungry, recent PhD graduate who's underemployed, and they say, we want you to teach a class specifically about your research for our students just once a week, 1 hour a week. And grad students like, you pay me $500, sure. And all these families get together and they get the best instruction in a very condensed amount of time from really qualified teachers. That's micro-schooling. Other people are starting to do something called world schooling, where they're essentially full-time travelers with their young children. You can search for world schooling blogs online, and you'll find all sorts of incredible families taking their kids with them as they travel. Some of these people are working, doing the digital nomad thing as they travel with their children, and others are doing the save up money for a while and then quit and travel for a few years type approach. So this is hot right now. All this homeschooling, unschooling, etc. stuff is happening right now in the United States. Turning the clock back a bit, democratic free schools, these are the things that popped up in the 60s and the 70s. These were the most popular thing after the countercultural revolution. And democratic free schools are super interesting. They're kind of like North Star in the sense that you are not required to do anything. There's a lot on offer, but you don't have to do anything. But they go a step beyond that, and they're democratic, which means every member of the school has an equal vote on anything important in the school. For example, the hiring and the firing of staff. If you go to a democratic free school, everyone, no matter if you're a staff member who's been there 30 years, or the 5-year-old who just joined last month, has an equal vote on those matters. This is actually the most likely type of model you're going to find across the world today, as far as really alternative schools go. They're everywhere, and largely thanks to this school, the Sudbury Valley School, also in Massachusetts, where all of our utopian fantasies are realized. The Sudbury Valley School is one of the schools that started in the 60s, but it clung on. It didn't die like all the other ones did. And through their leadership, there's been a lot of Sudbury model schools popping up in the US and abroad. And so if you search for Sudbury schools or just for democratic free schools, there are a lot more of them out there than you might think, and it's not just the United States. In the realm of public schools, there are some very cool public school models. Mostly they are charter schools or magnet schools. I think these are both US-centric terms. Which they're still public schools, but they get a little bit more freedom to focus on one academic area or another, or to treat their students a little bit differently. So they're never going to have the freedom to do what a place like a North Star or a democratic free school might do. But there's some inspiring models that have emerged. High Tech High in San Diego is one of the best known ones. They operate on a block system. And so kind of like Colorado College, you only study 1 or 2 things at a time, but you go very deeply into them. And they have a ton of technology. There are always the progressive alternative schools that most of us already know of. The Montessori schools, Waldorf, and Reggio Emilia. And these are already out there in the world. And kind of like the democratic free schools, this is your best gateway drug into alternative education. Like, a lot of parents who send their kids to a Montessori school when they're in preschool, you see, okay, things can be a little bit different. And then most families from there go right back into the normal traditional school system. But a lot of families keep going deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. So they end up somewhere crazy like unschooling. Finally, just in the past few years, there have been some really cool schools popping out of the world of tech entrepreneurship, which has a lot of overlap with the world of self-directed learning. Because the computer science majors in college cannot keep up with the pace of actual computer science development. That's when people start seeing like, okay, schools trying to teach technology, we have to do it a lot differently than the traditional way. And that idea is filtered from the higher education level down to the K through 12 level. And so there are countless out there. Acton Academy, Alt School, Brightworks, the Khan Lab School, which is actually started by Khan Academy, the website where you can learn all the science and math for free online. Khan decided to start a physical school after doing Khan Academy. Super interesting. So these schools make use of a lot of information technology, design theory, lean business principles, and the flipped classroom idea of, hey, instead of us lecturing to you, and then you go and work on the hard stuff at home, how about you listen to the lectures at home, and then we will together work on the hard stuff in person. So the punchline here is not only do educational alternatives exist, but they are thriving. We are living in a golden age of innovative schools and educational methods. And it's not just in these small communities that I'm talking about. People are starting to notice the parallels between entrepreneurship, which is about designing your own business or career, and self-directed learning, which is about designing your own education. The legal right to homeschool has been spread across the world. It's not just in North America, but the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and a handful of countries across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. So I think that for those of us who want to alter our own lives and help children to do the same, that there's actually no better time to live.